Okay, and we are recording live again. This is Amalia. And just again, as a reminder, if you have your camera and or microphone on, you are giving us permission to include that in the video. I now want to just share with you, and we'll read our bullying and harassment policy for the for the society. Here we go. All right, can you all see this?
Yes.
Fantastic. So I'll just read this out loud quickly. The SCA prohibits harassment and bullying of all individuals and groups. Participants engaging in this behavior are subject to appropriate sanctions. If you are subjected to harassment, bullying, or retaliation, or if you become aware of anyone being harassed or bullied, contact the Seneschal, President of the SCA, or your kingdom's board ombudsman. Okay. And just as a quick reminder, I'm going to have everyone mute themselves so that Mistress Amy can go through her presentation. And as people have questions, please type them in the chat and I will read them out. All right. Take it away, Mistress Amy.
All right. So hi, I'm Amy. So I first began studying Blackwork because I sort of did what everybody else who's new to the SCA or starts doing Blackwork embroidery in the SCA did. I did a collar and cuffs in double running reversible Holbein stitch. And then I thought, I'm going to enter this in A&S and I'm going to back document it because that always works out well. So when I went to back document, what I was doing, I'm looking through the historical record and I'm looking through and I'm trying to find these examples. And I started to sort of think that maybe what I had done wasn't necessarily what was as reflective of what we have in the extant historical record. So that was a little disconcerting for me because everybody knows Blackwork is done in the Holbein double running reversible stitch. And it is now modernly, that is absolutely a good option. And we'll talk as we go through about, where that has a place in history and textile history. But there's a little bit more to it when we start looking at the extant record, historical record. So I'm actually going to go ahead and share, and there are links to this too. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share my presentation here. And I'll be talking over it. Like you said, feel free to ask questions at any point. Amalia is going to interject and as necessary. And if you really can't wait, you can also interject too. That's fine. All right, can everybody see what looks like an opening slide, a smock of cambric wrought with Blackwork, an overview of monochromatic embroidery in early modern England during the reign of Elizabeth I?
Yes, you are good.
Okay. So actually I'm going to back up my slide for a second here. So one of the really interesting things that comes up sometimes is there is actually a quote in Chaucer that discusses, let me see if I can find the exact quote, that people have used to show evidence of, you know what? Stop. I'm going to back up even further. So let's talk about monochrome embroidery. I think that it is entirely possible that throughout the history of embroidery, somebody has used a single color of thread on a solid colored garment. So I think that we can all agree to that, right? Red on a plain linen background, blue on a plain linen background, Viking, Islamic, Japanese. I am sure that this is something that has come up again and again, that people are using one single color as an embellishment on a piece of fabric. I don't think that it is restricted just to the Elizabethans. When we're talking about English Blackwork, though, there are definitely characteristics that we can identify as being representative of that period, of that place and time. So I think monochromatic embroidery is, and we know that it is as old as embroidery itself. But when we're talking a little bit about the English embroidery, we are talking about some things that are different. So my first slide is actually a quick example of some historical pieces. So if you look, you can see these are Egyptian pieces. These are all Egyptian pieces. And they're obviously black, I believe it's silk. Oh no, cotton, black cotton embroidery done on a linen ground. And you can see these are geometric patterns. The one on the right actually looks very similar to what we might think of as modern blackwork, with that sort of pixelated, blocky style. So these are absolutely historically accurate for Egypt for the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. So this is one of those examples of something that has happened earlier in the extant record. In England at this time, there's actually a huge focus, and Amalia is a good one to talk about this. There's actually a huge focus on the Opus Anglicanum, which is that beautiful shaded silkwork with the gold work. So we're not seeing as much of this sort of black on white or single color on a fabric style at sort of this similar period in time. There is a quote from Chaucer that will get cited sometimes to talk about a history of English blackwork. A common translation goes, "Her smock was white and embroidered on the collar, inside and outside, in front and in back, with coal black silk, and of the same black silk were the strings of her white hood, and she wore a broad band of silk wrapped high about her hair." I don't know that this necessarily reflects what people would like it to reflect. I think that 14th century clothing, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't have a detached collar that is applied to a garment. There's a couple different translations where the embroidery could be happening on black silk as opposed to the embroidery itself being on black silk. So although sometimes it's represented as sort of showing that blackwork is an English thing going back to the 1400s, I don't know that that quote is necessarily as much evidence of that as maybe we would want it to be. But obviously, black on white or single color on a fabric ground embroidery is very old itself. But I wouldn't necessarily say that is particularly or specifically English. Does that make sense? Yes, no? Okay. What's interesting about these early pieces that are the Egyptian pieces, we do see some evidence of this throughout the Islamic world. And if you know anything about Islam as a religion, in general, portrayals of people are frowned upon. So you get a lot of these geometric patterns. So that's something that sort of, if you think about your geography of, the known world at the time, you sort of have Christendom in the north, and you've got the Islamic Empire sort of in this central region, and, two different representations happening, or two different things happening with their aesthetic representations, which I'll get back to in a second. So round about 1500, we start to talk about this idea of Catherine of Aragon bringing blackwork to England, right? I'm sure most of us have heard something very similar. And to some extent, it makes sense. Spain has, or what becomes Spain, has these ties to the Islamic world for good or for ill. And you think about the spread of the Islamic world into sort of the lower Mediterranean, and, that sort of being carried through up into Europe. I mean, it makes logical sense. However, when it comes to Catherine of Aragon, and specifically, to the best of my knowledge, and of course, somebody will find a stockpile of textiles in an attic in Gloucestershire someday. To the best of my knowledge, we don't have anything that is actually by Catherine's hands or attributed to Catherine. Like I said, it's the best of my knowledge. If anybody knows differently, let me know. Nor when we see representations of Catherine herself, is she overly represented with a lot of embroidery. And when you look through the Spanish museum websites and some of these different places, a lot of the textiles that are coming up in this very early 16th century, the early 1500s, a lot of them have an Italian attribution. So they seem to be of an Italian provenance. Which again, lower Mediterranean, you have that contact with the Islamic world. It's obviously very eye-catching. The black on white embroidery is very eye-catching. So to me, it sort of makes sense that this embroidery is being carried through the Islamic world into the Christian world. And, prior to the Reformation, if we're talking about bigger context, you have this idea of the whole of Christendom. So these countries are united under this umbrella of faith. And, you know, it's entirely possible that materials and designs and aesthetics are sort of being traded about. So when we look at this portrait here, we see a portrait on the left said to be Catherine of Aragon, and she does have what appears to be some very simple, you know, blackwork embroidery around her collar. And then we also see another piece, which is Spanish, and you can see some of, you know, something similar happening, that we sort of do have what appears to be more of that blackwork happening around the collar and on the sleeves. But you can see that it's a little bit different from what we think of as sort of that later English blackwork. And we're going to take a look at one of the earliest extant pieces. Oh, before I get there, here's another example of an Italian piece. This, you know, this is something that we might think of as more modern blackwork, although this isn't a 16th century piece. This geometric, pixelated idea, and you can see this is a model book, a later 16th century model book with some similar ideas. You know, these pieces could be related in a lot of ways, although these are not counted or pixelated in the same way. So jumping ahead, I'm going to skip that slide for a second. No, I'm going to go back to that one for a second. A few more early 16th century examples. We're seeing again this embroidery happening at the neck. Some of it looks a little bit more geometric. Some of it's a little bit thicker. This is going to come into play when we start looking at extant pieces in a minute or two here. And we also have this painting here, where we're looking at the Hans Holbein, the Madonna, and this little detail here. I really hate this painting. It's a beautiful painting. I hate it for a lot of reasons, because it does appear to be an example of pixelated, possibly double running, possibly reversible, counted blackwork embroidery. And so, of course, anyone who this painting as a beautiful example. And of course, it's Holbein, and I'm not a textile art. I mean, he's an artist, but he's not a textile artist. So there is the possibility that we have, we've got a couple different things that could possibly be happening here. It is entirely possible that this is beautiful black silk embroidery done in a geometric fashion on these bands, which are applied to the gown. That is absolutely a possibility. But it is a painting. So there are some other things that could be going on. We don't know what stitches it actually is. We don't know if it's a woven band that's being represented this way. What's also interesting is that Holbein's contemporaries represent some of this embroidery. Even looking at the Jane Seymour portrait, we have this very famous portrait of these ruffles and these cuffs. We've all seen this here. People love to recreate them, and it's absolutely stunning and eye-catching. This painting on the right, though, is from, and you can see that the embroidery is very different on the cuffs. Black on white embroidery in a couple different ways. And some are doing it with this very specific styling, and some are doing it a little looser, a little more florally. You know, unfortunately, what is being represented accurately. So I'm going to pause there for, anybody?
No questions currently in the chat. If anyone has any, please feel free to type them.
Okay. So, so what we can find, this is an extant piece of art. So I'm going to share this tab for a second. This is a shift. Did I jump to the Manchester Gallery page? Yes. Extant shift. It's an early 16th century, you can see it's got the square then gathered gathered pieces. So it's got a square neck. It's got, you know, sort of straight rectangular sleeves here. Okay. So this is what it looks like when it's laid out on a table. I was fortunate enough in person at the Manchester City Galleries, and Platt Hall is amazing. They actually foolishly leave you alone in a room with their 400-year-old textiles. So you do have to be on your best behavior. And you can see, this is a close-up of the embroidery from the sleeve, and this is a close-up of the embroidery from the neck. What's really interesting, you have this geometric pattern laid out, but then you can see these areas of dark. I do have a picture somewhere where you can actually see one of them is flopping up. So be content with sort of this single line of embroidery happening. We do see some of this double running fill happening here. And I haven't examined this close enough to see if these are precise being worked over 3 or worked over 2 or something like that. I also haven't necessarily looked to see if I think that they're counting these stitches. But you can see that even then they're supplementing this sort of straight geometric line with these denser areas of fill, which is not necessarily something that we do as regularly as we could when we make modern reproductions. And this is once again a piece up here in the corner. This is a piece from the sleeve, and this image are actually the inside of the sleeve. So when you look at the wrong side of this embroidery, you can see pretty easily that it is not, it may be worked in a double running in places, but it is not meant to be that sort of precise reversible that we think of, because clearly there are areas where this has been worked over or backtracked. There might be some back stitching happening here. And that's one of the earliest extant pieces that we have in England that I am aware of. Questions on this piece? Thoughts on this piece? Observations? Jump in? No? Okay. All right. Moving along, we are coming to the boys' shirt. So this is a pretty well-known shirt that is at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It is a slightly smaller shirt, probably made for, you know, a boy probably in that 7 or 8-year-old range. And you can see this is what, you know, that sort of collar and cuffs, but it's also ruffles, and it also has some seam detailing to it. When we look at this, I also got to see this in person at the Victoria and Albert Study Room. When we look at it up close, what we can see is that the stitches are actually something akin to a cross stitch. And you can see, so they're a lot denser. They are keeping kind of with that pixelated geometric form. You know, here you can see some of the strap work that you might find in the model books, but you know, there's a density to the thread that's being used, whether they're using multiple strands, but they're definitely using a denser stitch to give it this very eye-catching appearance, specifically on the ruffles and the wrist. And what's interesting too, when you look at this, if you can see the inside of this collar and the inside of this cuff itself, what is specifically the cuff, those are lined. So I don't know that I think an embroiderer who had who is making a lot of these garments by hand would spend a tremendous amount of effort to make something reversible if it was going to be lined. So that's just something to keep in mind when we are looking through some of these pieces. That isn't to say, you know, people are people. Embroiderers are embroiderers. There are some of us who absolutely love that mental challenge of working out the pathway all the way through and then working that pathway all the way back. And there are some of us that absolutely hate it and want to throw it out the window. So I think that both both embroiderers have a place in the historical record. So this is that same blue shirt, and you can see this is a seam treatment. The shirt is actually really interesting in its construction, the way the arm gusset is put together. But you can see you've got sort of these little, and these are probably a double, actually I think these might be a back stitch, but you can see you've got these little single lines coming out and then a braid stitch joining these together. So you have, part of that done. Let's see what I put on the next slide. So yeah, so you have this seam treatment happening. And it's beautiful, extremely eye-catching. And this is some of what we might see represented in the portraiture. You do see this idea, especially early on in the 16th century, of these sort of lines of embroidery happening, going down the sleeve. And some of that might be an insertion or an attachment together. When we look inside, you can see right in here that those weren't necessarily made with an eye towards being seen on the wrong side. It's probably a lot of back stitching happening. There's definitely some things happening with the result of the braid stitch going on. But you can see, now you can see the wrong side of the cuff is pretty reversible. This type of cross that's happening, or whatever going on with these stitches here, is being seen from both sides. And that makes sense when you have a ruffle. You have something that's going to be visible if it's flopping around on your arm. But when it comes to the inside of the shirt, there was not the same care taken in that specific manner. Okay. So these are the two earliest extant pieces of English monochrome embroidery that I am aware of. Like I said, somebody's going to find that stash someday and then we'll all be wrong. Or I'll be wrong. So, information changes all the time. And there's always the possibility, too, we always have pieces and collections that are now being digitized. So things that, haven't been seen for 50 years or 100 years are now starting to be seen, and things that, unfortunately, may have been seen before World War II. We definitely have things that are mentioned in museum catalogs from the 1930s, and now no one knows if they still exist because that museum or that area of the world was bombed. But I think whenever possible, it's my own prejudice, for want of a better term, to be informed by what we actually physically have. So that's always my personal drive, is to look at what's physically present in the extant record. Okay. This is an interesting painting. This is one of those paintings, Master John. This is a portrait of Catherine Parr. It's a little hard to see when you see this portrait in books. When you see it in person, you can see that the shift here has a lot of this single color, what appears to be embroidery all over it. And once again, you do see this more sort of geometric. You could see this might be inspired by a model book or an Islamic figuring happening here. Okay, so let's talk about sort of the glory days of English embroidery with the extant pieces, English blackwork embroidery, sort of that 1560s onward. So these are, I always like to show this one because sometimes when we look at embroidery, we don't always know what we're looking at. So this is a very common motif that shows up. This is a honeysuckle. And if you're in the Eastern United States, like me, you tend to see a lot of the Japanese honeysuckle, which is invasive, but the European honeysuckle is this this fellow right down here. And you can see that this, with the sort of closed petals and then the open petals, is a lot more reflective of this than the Japanese honeysuckle, which seems to be just sort of one of the trumpet flowers. This little fellow over here is a borage, which is actually a much smaller flower than you might think, maybe being 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And that's this pointy five-petaled flower that we see represented quite a bit in the embroidery. So you have this sort of universal embroidery, or this embroidery that's sort of borrowing from each other some contact with the Islamic world, but you have this embroidery happening in Italy and Spain and Germany and maybe England in the first half of the 15th century. And then in the 16th century, and then the second half of the 16th century, you have sort of this English embroidery sort of goes in its own direction. Why? What happened? The answer is Henry VIII and the English Reformation. So we go from having this sort of universal idea of Christendom to now England is an island and it is doing its own thing and it is going in its own direction. So a lot of the embroidery that we start to see at this point in time, the polychrome and the monochromatic, are informed by so you have the dissolution of the churches under the Reformation. So all of that effort that was put into ecclesiastical textiles, right? Those beautiful Opus Anglicanum pieces and these amazing chasubles and albs and all of those thousands of altar cloths and those thousands of different pieces of liturgical garb. All of that effort now has to go somewhere. So it becomes this we're no longer glorifying God in our church the same way, and we have a rise of the merchant class and the trades and things like that. So we start to think about glorifying ourselves in a lot of ways. So personal items, nightcaps and shirts and shifts and jackets and things that people personally wear and use, our own cushions, our own pillowcases, those begin to be embellished in a way that we hadn't necessarily seen in the earlier centuries. One of the biggest inspirations appears to be the English kitchen garden. So you get a ton of flowers that have, and herbs that have medicinal uses and fruit uses. You see pears and strawberries and peas. And you also see a delightful manner of little critters showing up. You can see in this one here, you've got snails. The snails pop up all over the place. I love them. Butterflies, birds, bees. There's one I'm going to show you later, which has a bunch of little fuzzy mammals, squirrels, frogs show up. So sort of you're looking out your window and you're getting inspiration. There is some evidence that herbals, which are being circulated at the time, and some specific types of model books, which are being circulated at the time, are also inspirational in these items. So this is a nightcap from the Victoria and Albert Museum and a koi from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and my apologies for not putting the numbers on there. But you can see more of these common flowers. You've got a cornflower or a dianthus, a pink. This is another borage. You've got this, cinquefoil, a 5-petal flower. These are like a foxglove. And this one over here, you can see you've got these birds hanging out. There's a violet. There's some strawberries. There's some lilies and thistles. You've got leaves. Also interesting to see is that even though we're doing black on white embroidery, what you're also seeing is accents with metal. Upon occasion, not always, but you do see metal accents. And you even see the use of these little spangles hanging out. Modernly, we tend to think of IKEA, you know what I mean? You sort of have a white room with, you think of a kitchen, a white kitchen with like the one red, mixer, and that's the focal point and the eye-catching piece. Or, you have your beige room and then you've got a bright green wall and that's your eyepiece, your centerpiece, your focal point. We see white space as something to set off the center image. I feel like the Elizabethans probably saw white space as something to be filled. And you'll see this in a lot of cases where you've got, you've got space and space and space and space and space. And, we're sticking a spangle, we're sticking a curlicue, we're adding something, we're adding more there. I've seen, there's actually an extant jacket, which is a monochrome jacket at, I believe it's the V&A, where the sequins are actually looking almost like fish scales, if you think about that, overlapping rows and rows of sequins. And even on this nightcap here, you can see these little sequins dangle and catch the light. And it would have been very opulent and very eye-catching, especially in a candlelit room or a fireplace lit room. Okay. This is, as we were saying, some of these, this is a caterpillar here. and you can see the thread has disintegrated, but it leaves the stitch holes. And this is one of those little mammals. You can see his little ears poking up. Boop, boop. It's like a little squirrel or chipmunk or something like that hanging out on this. So these pieces are all pretty good examples of one of the first families of Blackwork embroidery, which is this very standard curving vine work. We're familiar from this. We're familiar with this from the polychrome embroidery too. There's multicolored embroideries. We see these curving vines and, you know, little curlicues coming off of them, and they terminate in one standard motif, and then we fill in around that motif with these little critters or more curlicues or more spangles. These are more examples. There we go. There's the nightcap and a different coif. But you can see there's just this density of design that is happening with the Blackwork. And with all of this sort of late 16th century English design, you know, we're filling in, we're filling in, we're filling in. So another family, because I think that if we're talking about later 16th century English Blackwork, we can divide the aesthetics into sort of a couple of different families. We've got sort of this vine work, right? The curling vine work. We also have this strap work. So you can see on this pillow cover from the Royal Ontario Museum, we've got these lines making sort of cages, and then we're filling in each cage with a different design. And this one actually shows up, this sort of layout shows up quite a bit in the historical record. And it's another one of those examples that I don't think we represent enough in SCA embroidery. And I mean, I love the vine work, and I've done a bunch of the vine work too, the curving vine works. But this is definitely, I think, an area that is underrepresented in our recreations. And this one here, so this is that terrible smock from the V&A. And I say terrible because, and you can see some of it as we look up close, it is really, really densely done. And it is up close. I think it's really ugly. I know everybody's like, what? She didn't just go there. I did. I think that it's really densely done, and it looks sloppy. The layout looks a little sloppy to me. And I feel like it's, and you can see when we jump back to this one, you can see here when you're looking at it, I mean, those are really close together, and they're really large, and they're really chunky, and they're, you know, it's just not, I don't know, it's just not the prettiest example. And maybe it's my modern eye because I'm looking at this, and this has a little bit more white space, and it's laid out a little bit more, and this is, you know, chunky and put together.
It's like the 70s call. They want their curtains back.
Right, exactly. You know, you sort of have this crazy thing happening. And, you know, I mean, when you look at this pomegranate, right? We've got swirls and starbursts and swirls and starbursts. And then this fill pattern is different from this fill pattern. And then everything's outlined in sort of a buttonhole stitch. And then this fill pattern's a little different. And then we're still going to fill in these very thin slices with some detached buttonhole because we need it to be darker or more intense. It's really something. This is also a really interesting example as well, because this, we talk a lot about partlets in the SCA and in, you know, sort of 16th century clothing. And I think that this was one that hadn't been assembled, I believe, until relatively recently, maybe the past decade or two. And when you see it, make sure I'm in the right one. When you see it, you know, if you were to see it laying out, you would see sleeves and, you know, a bodice, a torso, front and back. So I think it would be very easy to interpret that as a partlet or, you know, just sort of something that you wore over a different smock. However, it actually had as part of it these decorated underarm gussets. Now, you know, maybe it's still the idea that you're sort of making, you know, a dickie, for want of a better word, to fit over the top of your clothing. And, you know, that's got, you know, so you're not sweating into your, richly embroidered fabric. But I do think it lends more credence to the idea that this was meant to be a smock itself and not necessarily what you might think of as a partlet. Because it did come, it did have these embroidered underarm gussets, which clearly match the rest of this outstanding embroidery together. And we do have smocks that are still in one piece that are embroidered solely on the top. So I'd love to find an example of just a Blackwork partlet, and there might be one out there. It's rattling around in my head like there's something floating around out there, but I don't know that I know of any concrete examples off the top of my head. But if anybody does, drop it in the links, and I will love you forever. So this smock is another one. It's another embroidered smock, and it is done with that same idea of the strap work. And you can see it here from a distance a little bit. You can see these lines are making these voids, which have a center motif. This was actually on loan at the Met Museum a few years ago. And I was not supposed to be taking pictures. And the docent told me not to take pictures because it was on loan from the V&A. And I said, oh, I've gotten to see the study room at the V&A and the study room in Manchester and the study room at the Museum of Fine Arts. And I pulled out my camera and she went around the corner. And I feel like I had run into a very kind docent that day who decided to not watch me take pictures of it. So she had to yell at me and decided to very discreetly walk around the corner while I took pictures of this thing that she had told me I should not be taking pictures of, so that I could add it to my collection. This does appear to be done in a double running. I did not get to see the inside of this, so I can't say for certain if it's a true double running, but it does. This is not a stem stitch, or does not appear to be a stem stitch. It does appear to be a back and forth. But if anybody's got a different interpretation of that, you can hit it. When I checked the V&A site itself, I do not believe it says specifically what stitches are being used. I believe it just says hand embroidered and hand sewn. Okay. So we talked about the curling vines. We talked about the lattice work. The next family that I want to talk about is sort of this diapered, which diapering is I believe it's a heraldry term. And it's sort of this one repeating motif or icon. These are two coifs at Platt Hall. This one is obviously much simpler than this one. And once again, this one is sort of the simplest example that I think I've seen out of all the black work. And you can see it's just very, one line of embroidery. And even here in these little leaves, that might even be, one stitch, exactly the way I might make little leaves. You do one stitch back and forth, like a Christmas tree. This one here is supplemented with obviously a lot of these gold knots here on the surface. And I think these are strawberries. This is the back of that one with the gold. And you can see that we do have some stuff going on here. First of all, the gold is, look at that. It is traveling all over the place on the back, right? They never carried their threads. Oh my goodness. Look at their threads being carried all over the place. I agree that I probably wouldn't want to carry my gold threads all over Heckin' Creation. But certainly, if you're carrying your thread over a quick inch or quick 3/4 inch, sometimes it makes more sense than stopping and knotting it or cutting it off or fixing it, But you can see. And you can also see, on some of these, sort of seeds in the strawberry, yeah, they are sort of just going back and forth in what's probably a running stitch or double running stitch. But there's definitely some other stuff happening here in the outline of that. And I do believe that might be stem stitch. It looks a little stem stitchy to me in the outline here. So this is something, we also see this in several jackets, several of the black on white jackets, where you sort of have this one motif. And sometimes it can be very ornate, but it is one repeating motif that is, you know, diapered back and forth across the jacket. Okay. This is the back of that little coif. So that very simple little coif, which looks like it would be very easy to execute in double running. You know, just work your little pathway out, you know, right? Go down this way, come back. When you actually see the back of it, it is not. This is actually one of the pieces that blew my mind. This was one of the very first pieces that I got to see in person, alone in a study room. And I was completely not expecting the back of it to look this way. I mean, look at the front of that. It would be so easy to trace that little path. You know what I mean? So to see it done this way, that's probably a bunch of back stitching. Really, really blew my mind. But it makes sense. I mean, if you put this coif on your head, nobody's looking at the wrong side of it. So if I'm much more comfortable with back stitch, that's what I'm doing. The last family that we really sort of have is these things with straps or stripes. I don't want to say straps, I want to say stripes. We don't have a ton of them that show up, but we do have a handful of objects. We see it in a lot of shirts. We have one or two coifs where they're sort of using striping to do their design. And you can see even within the stripes, sometimes they're copying that curving vine work, but they're still doing it within the context of the stripe. This shift you can see here, these are actually two stripes that run down sort of the back of the sleeve, the top of the arm. And you can see this is worked in stem stitch. This is another shot of the front of that shift. And I love this picture because you can see where somebody started to, they had much more ambition when they started this design that they, am I sharing the right tab? I'm sharing the right tab. They had much more ambition when they started this project. They even drew out the design to go all the way to the corner, and they cut it off. I don't know if they got tired. I don't know if they changed their aesthetic, but they opted to not complete it here. And you can see something similar down one of the sleeves. The embroidery near that wrist was supposed to be maybe 6 inches long, and instead you can see where the drawing for 6 inches is, but the embroidery itself is only about 3 inches long. So whether this was, you know, something somebody else drew out or somebody purchased it, you know, this is, if you make alterations on the fly and you leave ink on your design, you are replicating what happened in period. So let's talk about fills for a second, fillings of the embroidery. We have a couple different ones we see pretty regularly. We do have this sort of back and forth seed stitch, straight stitch happening. This is actually a jacket at the Museum of London. And you can see this is actually a diapered pattern. This is one big sprig motif that just gets repeated throughout the jacket. This is a coif at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. You can see this is using much tinier seed stitches or speckle stitches to create shading. I've seen the supposition that this is to mimic what's happening in woodcuts. So I think that that's an interesting effect. And I think it's a really, really eye-catching effect to add the shading. And then, of course, we have this absolutely wonderful geometric fills. You can find these patterns all over the internet. You know, sometimes these are given as their own thing, where you might see a website which has these patterns and people will use just the pattern on a set of cuffs or a collar, when, you know, we sort of see them in the record being more filling, as a filling stitch, that there's an outline, a stem stitch outline, or a worked outline, and then these are filling in. This is a pillowcase at the Cooper Hewitt Museum in in Newark. Actually, the museum is in Newark. They're not very nice when it comes to study rooms. I did get in, but they wouldn't let me bring anybody. So this is what the full pillowcase looks like. And what's interesting in a lot of these extant pieces is you can see some of these, you can see some of these examples where one side is faded and one side isn't. And that is probably the way they were on display in a museum. The story goes that Spanish black silk was more highly valued than English black silk. The English black silk tended to be heavier on the tannic acid from oak galls, whereas the Spanish seem to have a multi-step process where they're using indigo and then layering logwood over it and doing a couple different things. So it made a dye that was less caustic and acidic, and didn't eat your threads away the same way. But yes, you can see this is, what remains. And I think this is really interesting too. I see Anne is on the discussion. Mistress Anne, one of our founding guild mistresses. Hi, Anne. When you see these pieces in a picture book, right? If you were to see a black and white photo of this book, of this cover 30 years ago, you might not necessarily recognize what's happening here, or you might just see this side and you're sort of creating an object based on this idea that these motifs are spread out a lot more than they actually are. So we're extremely, extremely lucky to be living in the age we are, where we can download high-res images, or even, be able to go and see them. So this is a close-up of one of those lone images from that pillowcase. And you can see here, you've got these this stem stitch outline, which is really footy if you look at it. It gets it's not a very smooth line. You can see you've got these geometric fills. And once again, this petal is done differently than this petal. And this petal is done differently than this petal. And this one is different than this one. And this one is done different than this one. And we're still going to throw in some trellis stitch in the center to really add some more lushness to it, or deepness to it. So I think you can sort of see, that those are repeating themes. We sort of had this idea of density, more and more, more and more and more. And these are two more images from that pillowcase, just to show you some more of these fill patterns. Some of these very cute little fill patterns. And what's interesting is, in this particular pillowcase, somebody opted to not fill in everything. You know what I mean? These leaves, and you do have the veins on the leaves, which do fill it in to a certain extent, but somebody definitely chose which pieces to fill in and which pieces to leave unfilled. A little bit more of the speckling, and I included this because I sort of feel like we've got two examples. We've got a really talented example of speckling, and we've got maybe a slightly less talented example of speckling. Some of these stitches are a little bit bigger. These are much more, you can actually see that this is a stitch, where this looks more almost like a dot. These are a lot more evenly spaced, and they're not doing a gradation maybe of color the way these are happening. And this is just another, back and front. So this is that gorgeous handkerchief at the V&A. And you can see here, we do have this. I tend to think of this design as very Italian. You see it in model books. I know Countess Ianthe, with her New Carolingian model book, has done a lot of these patterns. But even within the context of this repetitive pixelated pattern, we add this trellis stitch to fill in. We've got some areas where we're adding these lines for shading and density. We're adding elements, so it's not just the simple geometric line. And I think that that's something that's really important to remember to include, no matter what stitches you use to do it. And you can find different examples of different stitches, but we're really thinking about this aesthetic, you know what I mean? We really want this lushness and this richness, and we really want to make sure that we're including these very, this density in our design. And this is, like I said, this is that great It's actually forehead cloth and a coif, and you can just see, I mean, because this is just, it would be so easy to just double run that bugger and just boo, 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 boo. But they didn't. Somebody backstitched that. And, you know, where to go in the future. So this is a forehead cloth from the Victoria and Albert's Museum. That's what it looks like in its entirety. And it's got a pelican and piety. So if you're making anything for an Elizabethan pelican, this is a good one to check out. And what's interesting here is when you look at it closely, and there was actually a forehead cloth I noticed, or not a forehead cloth, a nightcap I noticed it on too. What they're actually doing here is blending together two strands of thread. So you've got a white thread and a black thread that are being twisted together to give this shaded effect. And, you know, in the sort of the greater picture of this period of Blackwork embroidery, you sort of got this geometric, you know, maybe Islamic influence, maybe not, geometric design, but we still got some density, and then we're filling it in. We've got more and more density and more density. And then we get to the point where we're almost merging into the Jacobean, that 17th century Jacobean crewel work, C-R-E-W-E-L work, with this blending of the two fibers together, filling in more of the design and using a thread to represent the white space as opposed to allowing the ground to the white space to be the white space. All right, and that is a picture of me at Platt Hall, Manchester City Galleries, when I could not believe my luck that they were leaving me alone with these 400-year-old embroideries. And they really did. They're like, okay, you got your notebook and your camera. We'll be back in 4 hours. And I was like, oh my God. So talk to me, questions, thoughts, observations. I gave you an awful lot of information, I think, in that period of time. So everybody like shell shocked? Let me try that.
Now we're good. Thank you.
I just turned off
Wasn't sure if it was
presentation
just
audio.
me.
Is that better?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you.
It was like I went to a rave and nobody invited me or something.
Okay.
It was very exciting.
Oh my gosh. I hope people just, did you get weird feedback the whole time? I hope someone.
No, it was just the last like minute.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, Jesus.
So in the context of Athena's thimble, one of the reasons why I like doing this presentation is people often come up to me and say things like, oh my gosh, I really love Blackwork, but I hate doing counted. And I sort of want to be like, you don't have to do, I will stop presenting. You don't have to do counted. Uh-oh, where did I go? I don't know why we're looking at my ceiling. But okay.
We can see you. You're good.
Oh, I was looking at somebody's ceiling. Oh, I think it's Joanna.
That would be my ceiling because for some reason it.
No worries, no worries.
So,
yes. Go ahead.
I have this weird little pattern from the German Modelbarker, however you pronounce it.
Yes, model book, yeah.
That I thought was cool that I was going to try to do.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Yeah, and I think that you can see a lot of that, like in those shirt collars. You know what I mean? You can see it when they go down the front of the shirt and they go around the neck. But yeah, so I think that that's something that comes up. That comes up a lot. People, who hate counted, feel like Blackwork isn't accessible to them. When we really look through the record, and what we're seeing is a lot of pieces that are pretty clearly uncounted. You can't say for certain that somebody didn't sit down and count each stitch. And obviously, like I said, embroiderers are embroiderers, stitchers are stitchers. People who, are that thorough will count their stitches and make sure everything's good. But I think there's definitely, obviously in the extant record, things that are not counted and, far more common in the extant records for things not to be counted. Uh-oh, my family's going to join me. Bedtime, bud?
Mistress Amy,
Yes.
may I throw in a little history for the guild?
Yes, always, Mistress Anne.
Back in the earliest days, when we were trying to figure out what belonged where as far as categories, I am a counted thread person. Free embroidery and I just do not get along. Mistress Catherine Gilliesfleur is a free embroiderer of considerable skill. She's the one that introduced the stippling or the speckled stitch blackwork to this kingdom, because we didn't know it, but it was a way to do blackwork in free embroidery. And that category is one where we made the category based on what the final result looked like, rather than, oh, well, this is a counted thread technique, or this is a free embroidery technique. This is a category based on what the product looks like. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that you can do black work with backstitch. I've done some counted backstitch, which is really very pretty, but I gave the piece away. So, but that's just one thing. There are ways to get around a lot of the rules that people think there are. So yeah, if you like to free embroider, you can do black work. So that's all I wanted to say.
I think that's a great point about the rules, because I imagine that a lot of us have heard the blackwork is counted, except when it's not. Da, 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 da. I mean, it's all well and good to sort of go with the oral history of these art forms, but like I said, we're living in an age where you can go to the V&A website and download a high-res image and count threads if you really want to. So we don't necessarily have to we stand on the shoulders of giants like Anne and the work that they did.
Well, and the thing you have to remember about back in the beginning was we didn't have the internet.
Oh my gosh, yes.
We didn't have all of these books. And even if you had books, they didn't have the best pictures. And so some of this was just, well, I think this is what they did. It looks like what they did, I hope. So I guess we did okay in setting up things up back then, because we haven't had to make too many changes, which makes me feel a whole lot better about it. But yeah, it's just incredible. I know I've said this a lot of times, but it's just incredible when I look at where we were embroidery-wise when we started the guild, and the work that some of you are doing. It just blows my poor little mind.
I think I think she's being a little too modest, because if you ever get the opportunity to see the early work that Anne and Catherine and the founders did, I mean, knowing that they're working from a 2-inch square black and white picture in a book, it's really, really impressive.
You're very kind. I did some really good work 30 years ago. Whether I could do it again is my problem. And you know, I'm really impressed with the work that some of you all are doing. Mistress Nest had posted a piece of Japanese gold work that she had just finished. She posted it a couple weeks ago. It's gold medal on red. Oh my God. It's stunning.
All right, we do have a question. Sorry, Anne, I'm going to interrupt. Emmeline, you asked for feet wet for first projects. So it depends on what your, first of all, it depends on whether you're free or counted brain. I tend to suggest that people, first of all, find something that inspires them to look at, and then on the Montessori jump in with both feet, you know what I mean? Use the materials. But I think that, like, if you're used to working with DMC cotton floss, I think Splendor, which is a silk floss, is a really good transition to working with silk. A lot of the silk pearl and the silk oval, which are filament silks, they can be a lot trickier to work with. So if you're not comfortable with that learning curve, also depending on how much disposable income you have, the Splendor, I think, is a lot more affordable and reasonable to use. So I would definitely start with the Splendor as a black silk. As far as your ground, I think that we want to use finer linen than a lot of the extant pieces. They seem to be a little bit more, what I would say, a medium weight, a 5.3 weight, 5.3 ounce weight. That's what I would, a slightly more medium weight, I think, is what seems to represent, seems to mimic what we've seen in period. And it makes sense too. If you're putting a lot of silk or a lot of metal thread on something, you want it to hold up. It's got to be able to hold that weight.
Okay, so oh, sorry, Emmeline, did you want to
I was
follow up?
just going to say thank you. That's awesome. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
So jumping off of that question, I have a next step related to exactly that. So from what you observed, could you tell if the silk was, and you know what I'm going to ask, twisted or flat filament?
Whether it's a flat filament or a twisted filament. I think it really, I think that you can, I think we've had this discussion. I think you can make the argument for both. I think if you forced me to choose, I feel like I would come down on the side of the flat, the untwisted. I think the pink smock that was the Museum of London smock that had the embroidery that had been cut off or hadn't been finished, I feel like that looks very ropey to me, like a rope. So I feel like that might have been a twisted filament, because I just feel like there's a lot of twist when you really look up close at that stem stitch, which I don't know that you would get with just a flat filament, a flat filament silk. It's really hard to say, I think, what's an artifact of stitching and what's an artifact of the thread itself. Because, if you work with a twisted thread, you're going to find sometimes that it'll untwist, depending on which way you pull it off the spool, which hand you're using for the embroidery, which direction you're moving in. So I don't know that I could say for certain, but I think I feel like the evidence probably comes down on the side of the flat untwisted.
Okay. And did you observe any backing fabrics on anything, or was it always one layer of linen?
Well, on some of the shirts, you can see that there's a lining. You know what I mean? Instead of the cuff, you can see a lining.
Right,
on a lot of the coifs, what you see is almost an ear flap, which appears to be tucked under. Now, whether that's because they're cutting it out of a rectangle or they're tucking it under, it also ties into the coifs in particular, tie into the idea of the osiers, the ear irons. The sort of, it's a metal piece that goes over the head and it goes here. We were looking for evidence of like pinholes where it would actually be pinned to the coif to hold it in place. And maybe on some of the extant pieces, you can see what could be, rust marks left by a pinhole or something like that. So, and it would seem to feel like the flap or the lining is in those areas where you would want a reinforcing layer to pin something. So I think that's where I've seen everything else that I think I've seen has been mostly a conservation lining. The Nightcaps. I actually do have a book that shows the nightcap, even the nightcaps themselves being worked completely in one piece, and you just flipped it over to do the other side of the brim so that when you tucked it up, it was on the right side. So, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I was curious. So you didn't see stitching going through like 2 layers of fabric, for example?
Not that I have noticed. That doesn't mean I didn't see it.
Right. I asked because like
Yeah.
the opus work, sometimes it's 2 layers of linen and sometimes it's 1. And so I wonder if there's like,
Yeah, off the top of my
when we
head.
transitioned away from that.
Yeah, off the top of my head, there's nothing that I can recall that is obviously 2 layers.
That's awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. But hey, if anybody's got it, it could be out there somewhere. Any other thoughts, questions, observations? If there's any follow-up questions, you can always email me too, or find me on Facebook. I'm on the Athena Thimble Facebook group.
And I will post the slides and Mistress Amy's expert Blackwork paper one more time in the chat in case any of you missed it.
If anybody's curious, and I feel the need to explain that too. So it's not that I am calling myself an expert in the Athena's Thimble, which is the Embroiderers Guild of the East. We have certain rankings, and the highest ranking in a category is expert. So when it says expert paper, it doesn't mean that I'm saying I am, this is my expert. It's my paper for the expert panel. I just feel the need to point that out, that I'm not running around here saying, you know. I am currently the only person with the ranking in that, with an expert ranking in Blackwork in the guild. But there should be more of you. There's a lot of talented people in this kingdom. We got to start getting going.
All right. Well, if there are no further questions, I will stop the recording and say thank you so much, Mistress Amy. This was absolutely fantastic. It was great to have such a knowledgeable person speaking on this. Thank you so much.